Grace Madison's $2 million armored SUV sat buried axle-deep in mud on a storm-ravaged back road. No signal, no bodyguards, no one willing to stop. The most powerful CEO in the state stood helpless in the pouring rain, and for the first time in her life, money couldn't fix the problem. Then a rusted Land Rover Defender rolled out of the dark, driven by a single father and his small daughter. People laughed at the old wreck. But within minutes, that battered machine hauled Grace's empire out of the mud and pulled a secret to the surface that could destroy her. Stay until the end, because the poorest man that night was carrying the most valuable truth of all. Grace Madison didn't do uncertainty. At 39, she had built Meridian Group from a 2-room consulting office into a $500 million industrial holding company, and she had done it without apology, without sentiment, and without a single miscalculation she couldn't immediately correct. She scheduled her days in 15-minute blocks. She had 3 assistants whose only job was to make sure nothing in her world operated outside of its assigned parameters. She wore the same shade of deep charcoal in every boardroom photograph, not because she lacked imagination, but because she refused to let anything as trivial as a wardrobe decision consume a second of her attention. On the evening of the storm, she was traveling by private convoy to the Caldwell Summit, where a $300 million logistics merger was set to be finalized by midnight. The contract had taken 14 months to negotiate, and every clause bore her fingerprints. The convoy was 3 vehicles: the armored SUV worth $2 million, a support truck carrying her legal team's documents, and a trail vehicle with 2 of her most trusted security escorts. The SUV itself was a bespoke commission hand-built chassis, reinforced titanium underframe, adaptive terrain management systems that could theoretically navigate anything short of open water. Grace had paid for the best because she believed that money, applied precisely, could eliminate almost every form of vulnerability. That belief had never been seriously tested. Not until that night. The storm system had been building all week off the coast and was projected to make landfall well north of their route. But weather, unlike contracts, does not respect projections. By 7 in the evening, the outer bands had pushed south faster than any model anticipated. Rain began as a light mist, then thickened to a curtain, then became something that felt less like weather and more like a sustained assault. The highway that should have taken them straight to Caldwell was closed at the Remington overpass. A mudslide had covered 2 lanes, and Highway Patrol had redirected all traffic east. The convoy GPS automatically rerouted. What the GPS did not calculate was the condition of that rerouted road. Route 16A was a county access track rarely used even in dry weather. In the middle of a storm now dumping nearly 3 inches of rain per hour, it became something else entirely. The first quarter-mile was passable. The second was rough but manageable. Just past the half-mile marker, where the road curved sharply between 2 old drainage fields, the ground simply gave way beneath them. The support truck pulled off and stopped in time. The trail vehicle reversed. But the armored SUV, 6,000 pounds of engineered perfection, drove into a soft patch that looked solid and wasn't. The adaptive terrain system registered the problem 0.3 of a second after the rear wheels dropped. By then, the vehicle had already settled 8 inches into saturated clay masquerading as a road. The driver, a man named Holt, tried the automatic terrain recovery mode first. The system cycled through 4 pre-programmed responses and produced nothing but the high-pitched whine of wheel spin against slick earth. Grace watched the dashboard indicators blink through diagnostics with the clinical detachment of someone trying to stay calm by focusing on data rather than reality. Holt tried manual control. Then he tried again. The SUV rocked once and sank 2 more inches. When Grace stepped out of the vehicle to assess the situation herself, her shoes disappeared into mud past the ankle on the first step. She tried her phone. No signal. She walked to the trail vehicle and tried theirs. Nothing. The convoy's encrypted satellite communicator, the device that was supposed to guarantee contact under any conditions, displayed a solid red light. Grace looked at it for a long moment, then back at the road, then at the rain coming off the dark tree line in horizontal sheets. Her legal team sat in the support truck 50 yards back, equally stranded, equally silent. The midnight deadline for the Caldwell signature was not a metaphor or a suggestion. It was a contractual termination clause. If she wasn't in that room by midnight, the merger dissolved by default. For the first time in 14 months of preparation, Grace Madison had no move to make. Lucas Carter had been on the road since 4 in the morning. His day had started, as most of his days started, with coffee he made himself, a lunch packed for Ella, and a list of jobs written on the back of an envelope because he didn't own a planner. He was 36 years old and ran a one-man shop out of a converted barn on the eastern edge of Harlow County, fixing agricultural equipment, off-road vehicles, and anything else people brought him that the dealerships charged too much to touch. He wasn't making a fortune. He was making enough. That distinction had taken him several years to become comfortable with, and on most days, he was. Ella had come with him that afternoon because school had closed early for the storm and there was nowhere else for her to be. She was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, a combination that made her simultaneously the easiest and most complicated person Lucas had ever tried to raise on his own. She sat in the passenger seat of the Defender with a library book open across her knees, reading in the last of the gray afternoon light without complaint, occasionally pointing out animals she spotted in the fields as they drove. Lucas had promised her they'd stop for soup on the way home. It was that kind of evening. They had just finished dropping off a rebuilt transfer case assembly at a farm about 12 miles east when the storm turned serious. Lucas wasn't worried about the weather. The Defender was old, a Series 3 restoration he had bought for $400 as a rusted carcass and rebuilt from the frame over the course of 2 winters. It had no satellite navigation, no automatic terrain management, no adaptive anything. What it had was a straight-axle front suspension, a properly rebuilt transfer case, 46mm lift springs, and a mechanical simplicity that Lucas understood the way some people understand music instinctively, completely, and without needing to explain it. He trusted it because he had built it, and he knew every inch of what it could and couldn't do. It was Ella who spotted Grace first. The Defender's headlights swept the road ahead and caught the figure standing at the shoulder, a woman in a dark coat, no umbrella, one arm half raised. Behind her, half in the ditch, sat the most expensive-looking vehicle Ella had probably ever seen in person. The girl closed her book. "Dad," she said quietly, "that lady's stuck." Lucas slowed. He looked at the SUV, looked at the road, looked at the trees, read the mud the way a doctor reads a scan. He also looked at the woman, and he recognized the particular posture of someone who was furious about being helpless. He had seen that posture before, in board members of companies that had wronged him, and he had learned that people who wore it were rarely grateful and often complicated. He kept the Defender rolling. "Dad." Ella's voice had changed register. It was no longer a question. Lucas stopped the truck. Then he turned it around. When he pulled up beside the SUV, a man in a damp suit halted. The driver came toward him with the expression of someone already forming a dismissal. He looked at the Defender, at the rust seams along the door panels, at the cracked window rubber. He looked at Lucas in work boots and a canvas jacket. He looked at Ella, who looked right back at him with calm, unblinking eyes. "Appreciate the thought," Holt said, not appreciating it at all. "But there's no way that thing pulls a vehicle this size." Lucas didn't argue. He got out, pulled a flashlight from behind the seat, and walked to the edge of the mud. He crouched down and put the beam on the ground, reading the angle of the SUV's rear axle, the depth of the track impressions, the slope of the drainage field. He was doing in 30 seconds what no application on the market could replicate, because the information he was using wasn't digital. It lived in his hands and his memory and the 12,000 hours he had spent under vehicles in the field. Grace had watched all of this from a few feet away, arms crossed, expression closed. She was not accustomed to waiting for other people to assess her situations, and she was especially not accustomed to being assessed by men in canvas jackets who hadn't yet said a word to her. "Well," she said. Lucas stood up, brushed the mud off his knee, and looked at her evenly. "It's fixable," he said, "but I need you to do exactly what I say." Grace Madison had not taken an unqualified instruction from anyone since she was 22 years old. She had, over the course of her career, fired 3 executives for failing to deliver, restructured 2 failing subsidiaries, and renegotiated a hostile acquisition while simultaneously managing a legal challenge in 2 separate courts. The idea that a mechanic in a wet canvas jacket was about to tell her what to do on the side of a county road while her $2 million vehicle sat in a ditch was, objectively, the strangest experience of her professional life. She agreed to it anyway, because she didn't have a choice, and because the midnight deadline was not going to move. Lucas worked methodically and without theater. He asked Holt to remove every piece of luggage and equipment from the SUV's cargo area: briefcases, document boxes, emergency kit, everything. He then positioned the Defender at a specific angle to the SUV, not directly behind it as Holt had suggested, but offset 15 degrees to the right to account for the lateral drift in the mud and the camber of the drainage field. He attached his recovery strap, a kinetic rope rated for 11,000 pounds, to the SUV's factory tow point, walked the length of it to check for fraying, then connected the far end to the Defender's rear recovery anchor with a shackle pulled from a canvas bag behind his seat. He moved without rushing. He moved like someone who had done this before and expected it to work. "Everyone behind the tree line," he said. "If the strap snaps, it moves fast and it moves in every direction." Holt started to protest. Lucas looked at him once. Holt moved. Grace retreated with the others and watched with the focused attention of someone cataloging every variable. What she saw was a man with no visible technology making a series of precise, interconnected decisions based on nothing but observation and experience. There was no application, no terrain algorithm, no dashboard indicator. There was a man reading mud and physics and mechanical geometry with the same confidence she read balance sheets. It was unexpectedly interesting. Lucas got back into the Defender. He let the engine idle for a moment, and in the relative quiet between rain bursts, Grace heard it, the sound of an engine that had been carefully tuned, not battered and neglected as the body suggested. It was smooth and deliberate. He put the truck in low-range second gear, took up the slack in the recovery rope until it was taut, and then applied steady, even throttle. The Defender's tires found purchase in the gravel at the road edge. The rope went rigid. This SUV didn't move. Holt made a sound that might have been a laugh. Lucas backed off the throttle, repositioned 6 inches to the left, checked the rope angle from the window, and tried again, this time building the pull more gradually, using the kinetic energy stored in the rope's stretch to augment the truck's traction. The Defender rocked back. The rope loaded, and Grace felt rather than heard the low, resonant crack of the SUV's chassis beginning to shift. One rear wheel lifted slightly. The mud made a sound like something being unsealed, and then, in a single surging movement, the SUV lurched free of the ditch and rolled back onto firm ground. Grace stood very still. Ella made a sound of pure delight and grabbed her father's arm when he climbed out to inspect the rope. Holt stood in the rain looking at the SUV, then at the Defender, as if running some internal recalibration he hadn't expected to need. Grace walked forward and looked at the SUV, all 6,000 pounds of it, now sitting upright on solid ground, then at Lucas, who was crouching by the recovery point to unhook the shackle with calm, practiced hands. "Thank you," she said. It came out sounding like an official statement rather than a human one, which was a habit she had never successfully broken. Lucas looked up. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction at having proven something. "The terrain system on that truck is a good tool," he said, nodding at the SUV. "But tools only work when the conditions match what they were designed for. Out here, they weren't." He stood and began winding the recovery rope, almost to himself. That's an expensive machine to be so dependent on a signal. Grace reached into her interior jacket pocket and removed a money clip holding a sheaf of bills she kept for transactions requiring discretion. She counted out several $100 notes without checking the total. It was a gesture, a reflex, the social vocabulary she used in situations she needed to close cleanly. She held it out to Lucas with the automatic confidence of someone who has always found that offering enough money resolved things efficiently. He looked at the money. Then he looked at her. "No thank you," he said. This was not the expected response. Grace could count on one hand the number of times that offer had been declined, and in every previous case there had been an agenda attached, something larger, something negotiated. She studied Lucas' face for the strategy. There wasn't one. He genuinely didn't want it. "I'd appreciate the cost of replacing the recovery rope," he said. "That one stretched beyond its rated limit on the second pull. I'll need a new one." He named a specific figure, not a round number, not a padded estimate. An exact, fair amount. Grace pulled the appropriate bills and held them out. He took them, folded them once, and put them in the front pocket of his jacket without ceremony. She didn't know what to do with that. She had built her career on understanding what people wanted and using that understanding as leverage. A man who wanted nothing beyond the cost of a broken rope represented a kind of transaction she wasn't equipped for. "I'm Grace Madison," she said, because she was used to that name producing a reaction. "Lucas Carter," he said, producing none. He walked back to the defender to store the rope. Grace followed 2 steps, then stopped. Ella had moved to the far side of the SUV and was crouching beside the rear bumper, looking at something in the mud. A small, flat object, dark-colored, half buried in the churned earth at the edge of the ditch. She picked it up, wiped it on the hem of her jacket, and carried it to Grace with the direct purposefulness of a child who has not yet learned to hesitate. "I think this fell out when the car moved," she said. It was under the wheel. It was a USB drive compact, matte black, slightly scuffed. On one flat face was a white logo, a stylized double arrow. It took Grace less than 2 seconds to recognize it. That logo belonged to Torrent Dynamics, the holding company controlled by Jackson Wyatt. Grace took the drive and held it with the careful stillness of someone controlling a reaction. Jackson Wyatt was her principal competitor, the one man she had spent the last 3 years systematically outmaneuvering, bitter, professional adversaries forged in contested acquisition battles and boardroom depositions. There was no reason whatsoever for hardware carrying his company's logo to exist in her vehicle or on a road she was only using because of a last-minute GPS reroute. She became aware, in the way certain people are trained to become aware, that the situation had changed categories entirely. Lucas was standing by the defender's tailgate. He hadn't heard the exchange, but he looked up when he registered the shift in Grace's body language, the particular stillness of someone processing a threat. He looked at the USB. He looked at the road behind them. A pair of headlights had appeared at the far end of the access road, too distant to read clearly, but moving slowly in the rain, which meant they weren't passing through. "Is there anyone who knew the exact route you were taking tonight?" he asked. She met his eyes. For the first time, something in her expression wasn't management. "Only my convoy coordinator," she said, "and no one outside the company." "Then I'd suggest you don't call anyone inside your company right now," Lucas said quietly. He looked at Ella. The girl read his face with the accuracy of a child who has learned to watch her father for information, and she moved without being asked, climbing quietly into the defender's rear seat. Grace looked at the USB, then at the headlights, then at Lucas Carter, and she made a decision she would not have believed herself capable of 12 hours earlier. She got in the truck. Lucas's workshop was 4 miles from the access road, down a gravel track that didn't appear on the GPS reroute system and probably hadn't appeared on any updated county map in 15 years. He knew it by instinct, by the rhythm of the road under the tires, by the angle of the single fence post that marked the turn. He drove with the headlights on low and said nothing. Ella sat in the back with her library book closed across her knees, watching the rain on the rear window. Grace sat in the passenger seat holding the USB drive and saying nothing either, which was notable, because Grace Madison had never been comfortable with silence. The workshop announced itself as a large shadow against the tree line, a converted barn with a corrugated metal roof, a wide rolling door on the side, and a single sodium lamp above the entrance that flickered in the wind. Lucas pulled in, killed the engine, and got the door closed while Grace looked around the interior with the expression of someone trying to recalibrate a scale. It was not what she was accustomed to. The floor was bare poured concrete, cracked in places and stained with a decade of grease and hydraulic fluid. The walls were hung with tools organized on pegboard, wrenches by size, sockets by drive. Nothing decorative, everything functional. A rebuilt engine block sat on a stand near the back wall. 2 vehicle lifts, both manual, a wood stove in the corner that Lucas lit without being asked, a small folding table by the east wall, and beside it a narrow cot, the kind of setup a man installs because some repairs run past midnight. But there were other things too. A child's drawing pinned above the workbench crayon, a yellow car, 2 stick figures, a photograph on the shelf above the oil cans, slightly warped by humidity, of a woman laughing at something off-camera. Ella's winter coat hanging on a hook by the door. A half-finished model of a four-wheel drive drivetrain on the work table built not from a kit but from actual scaled components, bearings, shafts, differentials, all functional. Grace didn't comment, but she noticed. Lucas produced a laptop from a locked drawer, old and thick, running software installed in layers over many years, but fully functional. He opened it and set it on the folding table. "I'd wait until you understand what's on it before you decide what to do with it," he said. She plugged in the USB. The drive was encrypted, but only at the outer directory level, a layer designed to deter casual access. Lucas looked at the encryption signature. "That's a standard Torrent Dynamics Enterprise wrapper," he said quietly. "I've seen that format before." Grace looked at him. "How would you know their encryption format?" He didn't answer immediately. He pulled a 3-digit code from memory and typed it. The drive opened. Inside were 4 file folders. The first contained GPS manipulation logs, next records of modifications made to the navigation data pushed to their convoy's vehicle systems. The modifications had been inserted at 11:43 that morning, rerouting the convoy away from the highway to Route 16A using a false obstruction flag that had never been registered with any legitimate traffic authority. Someone had fabricated a highway closure. The second folder held communication records between a Torrent Dynamics operational account and a mobile number Grace didn't recognize immediately. It took her 40 seconds and a cross-reference with her own phone's archived contacts to place it. It belonged to Garrett, the convoy's route coordinator, a man who had been with her logistics team for 2 years. The third folder contained a draft data extraction plan, specifying the contents of the document server in the support truck by file name, and detailing a 3-minute window during which the convoy's encrypted communications blackout, caused by a jammer, not weather, would allow the extraction to occur. The blackout had been scheduled for 8:15. Grace looked at her watch. It was 8:47. The fourth folder was the one that required her to sit completely still for nearly a full minute. It contained financial disclosures, internal Torrent Dynamics records showing a series of payments, totaling slightly over $2 million across 18 months, made to a patent acquisition shell company. The shell company's name was unfamiliar to her, but the patent numbers listed in the transaction records were not. She turned the screen toward Lucas without a word. He looked at it. The stillness that came over his face was different from the professional calm she had seen on the road. This was older, heavier. "Those are my patents," he said. The room held nothing but the wood stove and the rain on the roof. Lucas had, 3 years prior, developed a proprietary torque bias differential, a system that redistributed drive force between individual wheels in real time based on terrain input, using pure mechanical logic rather than electronic sensors. When the commissioning company dissolved, the patent had been filed in his name. 2 years later, a shell acquisition company had contested the filing, leveraged obscure assignment clauses in the original commission contract, and taken the rights through a 9-month legal process he couldn't afford to fight properly. The acquisition was supposed to look opportunistic. Jackson Wyatt's operational records now proved it was orchestrated. "He took your work," Grace said. "He took everything I built," Lucas replied, in a voice that had long ago decided not to be bitter about it. Grace looked at the USB drive in the laptop's port and thought carefully about the specific, branching sequence of decisions that had produced this particular moment, a drive found by a child in the mud on a road no one was ever supposed to be on. "He set both of us up," she said. Lucas nodded slowly. "Looks like it." The headlights appeared at the far end of the gravel track at 9:12. Lucas had been watching for them from the workshop's single road-facing window, a small, grimy rectangle of glass above the workbench, monitoring it every few minutes while Grace worked through the drive's contents, and Ella sat cross-legged on the cot with a mug of hot chocolate, pretending to read. When the lights appeared, he said nothing alarming. He turned from the window, moved to the center of the room, and picked up Ella's coat from the hook by the door. "Come here, sweetheart," he said, in the same voice he used to tell her dinner was ready. Ella came without drama. She understood her father's economy of expression well enough to know that particular flatness meant seriousness handled correctly, not panic, not improvisation. Lucas carried her to the far corner of the workshop, where two floor panels beneath the storage shelving lifted to reveal a clean, dry space about the size of a large closet, built under the original barn's stone foundation. He had installed it years ago as a parts archive, but it was warm, had a battery lantern, and was accessible only to someone who already knew it was there. He set Ella down inside, handed her the lantern, and looked at her. "I need 30 minutes, he said. "I know," she said. He closed the panel. He turned to Grace and kept his voice low. "There's a rear exit behind the engine stand. Leads to a footpath that runs along the fence line to the east side of the property. The Defender's parked facing the track, not the door, which means we have roughly 90 seconds from when they reach the lot to when they get a line of sight inside." He handed her a small radio from the shelf above the workbench. "If we get separated, Channel 7. Grace took the radio. She had managed multi-country acquisitions in rooms full of hostile parties, but she had never been handed an exit plan that involved a root cellar and a fence line, and the combination produced a clarity of focus she found unexpectedly clarifying. They went out through the rear, moving along the fence in the dark. The rain was lighter now, steady but no longer driving, and the ground underfoot was compacted gravel and old pasture grass. Lucas moved quickly and without noise. Grace moved quickly and made noise, because she was wearing ruined heels and had not trained for this scenario, but she kept pace. Behind them, through the trees, they heard vehicle doors closing. 2 vehicles. 2 doors each. 4 men, minimum. Lucas had already circled wide to the east lot, where the Defender sat under a rusted tin canopy used for overflow parts storage. He got in, started it without the headlights, and reversed out of the canopy on memory alone, 12 years of knowing exactly where every corner of that property sat in the dark, then took the east fence track through the pasture gate, which he had unlocked that afternoon when returning from the parts delivery, without any specific reason to do so at the time. Preparation was not paranoia. It was habit. The Defender moved through the dark pasture at a speed that felt agonizing but was optimal. No headlights. No road. Lucas navigated by the tree line to the left and the fence line to the right, tracking his position by the change in ground texture under the tires. The men behind them had faster vehicles with better sensors, and none of that helped them in the dark on terrain they had never seen. Grace watched the tree line. She kept her breathing steady. At one point Lucas glanced at her and she made a small dismissive gesture. He noted it and kept driving. They came out onto the secondary track running parallel to Route 16A about a mile north of the mud field. Lucas stopped the Defender, cut the engine, and listened. Nothing behind them for 45 seconds. He opened the glove compartment and handed Grace a strip of gauze and a small metal clip from the first aid kit he kept there. Not a commercial kit, but a practical one built from experience, containing only what had actually mattered over the years. She noticed the cut on her foot then, wrapped it without being asked, and clipped it without ceremony. She looked at him in the dark of the cab, and there was something in her expression that had not been there an hour ago, not gratitude exactly, because gratitude still carries a hierarchy. It was something closer to recognition, the kind that moves in both directions. "You've done this before," she said. "Not exactly this," Lucas said, "but I've always known how to find a way out." She believed him. That was the strange part. She had spent her career calibrating instruments of professional skepticism over decades. Something about Lucas Carter, his economy of movement, his refusal to perform anything, made her believe him in a way she couldn't locate in her usual framework. "We need to stop running," she said. He looked at her. "We need to let them think they've cornered us," she said, "and then show them what they've actually walked into." Something quiet moved in his expression. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you have." They talked for 20 minutes in the dark cab while the rain tapered to mist. Grace had, in her structured and systematic way, already catalogued every relevant piece of information she carried about Jackson Wyatt, the public record, the private intelligence her team had gathered over 3 years of competitive maneuvering, and the new material from the drive. Lucas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How did you first run into him?" he asked. She told him. 3 years ago, Torrent Dynamics had attempted a hostile acquisition of a mid-sized industrial parts supplier Grace was using as a supply chain anchor. She had blocked it through a competing bid, forcing Wyatt to pay 40% more than the asset was worth just to win. He had never forgiven her in the way that certain men never forgive being outmaneuvered by someone they had underestimated. The Caldwell merger was, in part, an extension of that original contest. If Grace secured Caldwell, she would have the distribution infrastructure to make Torrent Dynamics' core logistics division commercially redundant within 18 months. Lucas was quiet for another moment. Then he said, 2 years ago, a shell company called Meridian Asset Partners contested my patent filing. Grace looked at him. I know that name, she said. It's a subsidiary, he replied. 3 layers removed from Torrent Dynamics. I found the structure after I lost the case, but the legal window had already closed. He paused. The patent covered a variable torque bias differential, a system that redistributes drive force between individual wheels in real time based on terrain input, without electronic sensors. Pure mechanical logic. The commissioning company's lawyer argued the original contract assigned all derivative innovations to them. I argued it was an independent development. I was right. I didn't have the money to prove it. Grace thought about the 4th folder, the payment records, the shell company, the patent numbers, and recognized the signature. She had spent 3 years studying Wyatt's operational team. It was the same hand. He took your work and used it to fund the legal architecture that's been coming after me, she said. Lucas looked through the windshield at the mist. I don't know if I'm the only one, but that would fit. She looked at him properly for the first time without any of the professional apparatus she usually placed between herself and other people. What she saw was a man who had been doing, for the last 2 years, exactly what she had been doing, maneuvering around a powerful opponent, trying to protect what mattered most, using the resources available to him. His resources were a rusted truck in a barn workshop and 12 years of knowledge stored in his hands. Hers were a legal team and a financial war chest and a talent for negotiation so refined it had become instinct. They had both been working in isolation, each unaware they were 2 faces of the same problem. Why mechanics? She asked. It was an odd question for the situation, but she had been building toward it. Lucas looked at her with the mild expression of someone who has long since made peace with a thing and no longer needs to explain it. After my wife died, he said, I needed somewhere quiet. Somewhere that made sense the same way every day. A broken engine is always broken for a reason you can find and fix. People aren't like that. A pause. And Ella needed someone around, not someone traveling for presentations. He said it without self-pity, which is the hardest way to say a true thing. Grace thought about the photograph on the shelf above the oil cans, the woman laughing at something off camera. She thought about the child's drawing pinned above the workbench. She was aware that she was experiencing something she hadn't made room for in quite some time, the discomfort of being genuinely moved. She filed it. She would process it later. Right now there was a problem to solve. He wants the Caldwell data, she said. Let him think he can still get it. Lucas looked at her, and for the first time since she had gotten into his truck, she saw the engineer in his eyes, the part of him that processed problems geometrically, that saw solutions in structure. Show me what you're thinking, he said. The plan was built in pieces, the way good plans are, each element tested against what they knew about the terrain, physical and human. Grace understood Jackson Wyatt's ambitions and blind spots. Lucas understood the geography and every structure on the 15-mile stretch between the workshop and the Caldwell facility. Together they had the 2 things a trap requires, knowledge of the predator and knowledge of the ground. Lucas first went back for Ella on foot while Grace worked through the USB data in the cab. The girl was awake and calm in the stone cellar, eating crackers from a tin she had found on the shelf, with the battery lantern propped on her knee. She asked no questions Lucas hadn't anticipated, and she accepted the summary of the situation with the matter-of-fact processing of a child who has grown up watching her father solve mechanical problems under pressure. She was back in the Defender's rear seat within 15 minutes, wrapped in her father's jacket. Lucas had in his workshop, among various pieces of salvaged equipment, portable signal relay, a modified radio repeater he had built several years earlier for communications dead terrain during off-road recovery operations for a local club. It was old, battery-powered, with a range of about 8 miles in clear conditions and somewhat less in weather. Enough. Grace gave him the encrypted address for her legal firm's direct data server, a number she had committed to memory specifically because she did not trust any device to hold it, and he configured the relay to push a compressed copy of the drive's contents to that address in a single burst transmission. He worked with the focused fluency of a man operating entirely within his competence. While he worked, Grace made the call she had been building toward for the last hour. She reached Jackson Wyatt's personal line on speakerphone, with her own phone recording the conversation through a secondary device Lucas had handed her, an old digital recorder he kept for documenting repair diagnoses, which now served a different diagnostic purpose entirely. She made the call sound like what Wyatt expected: a desperate CEO, stranded, cut off from her team, willing to negotiate to avoid losing the Caldwell deal entirely. She was calm in the way a person is calm when performing calm, which is its own kind of skill, and one Grace possessed at a level very few people understood. Wyatt answered on the second ring, which told her he had been waiting. He offered sympathy, spoke in plausible deniability, and kept his language technical and uncommitted. But Grace had spent 14 months in negotiation with people who understood the Caldwell deal's internal architecture, and she knew which information was both too specific and too operational for Wyatt to possess unless he had an insider working the convoy. She fed him a false document set, then asked if he could guarantee its safety if she handed over the convoy's coordinate data. He agreed, and in doing so, used the specific internal phrasing from a single operational memo that no outside party should ever have read. She pressed him further. He confirmed a file path that could only have come from Garrett. It was not a full confession. It was enough. She disconnected. Lucas was watching her from across the workshop. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. The second element of the plan used the Defender in the role it had already played once that night. Lucas drove them to a decommissioned equipment yard 4 miles east, a flat, fenced expanse of old farming machinery and stacked concrete barriers that he had used for vehicle recovery training 3 years prior. He had a key to the side gate. He left Ella in the truck, locked, with the radio on Channel 7, and went over the yard's layout with Grace by flashlight and a hand-drawn sketch on the back of an envelope. When Wyatt's people arrived, because Grace had implied in the call that this was where she would be waiting with the drive, Lucas was already in position at the fence line. 3 vehicles came through the main gate, moving with the overconfidence of people who believed they were arriving at a resolution. They fanned out across the yard the way groups do when they expect to find one person standing in a field. Instead, they found a locked gate behind them, pulled shut and secured by the Defender's recovery winch, which Lucas had run through the gate's frame from outside the fence line. And they found Grace Madison standing in the center of the yard in the rain, calm as a closing argument, with the recording running and every exit point blocked by 2 tons of old cast-iron farming equipment that went nowhere without a machine to move it. She raised her phone and said clearly, for the record, "Mr. Wyatt, my lawyers are listening. Say hello." The Caldwell Summit was held in a glass and steel convention facility at the edge of the city, a building designed to project stability and permanence, which made it the kind of setting Grace had always preferred for moments that were actually unstable and temporary. She arrived at 11:41, 19 minutes before the contractual deadline, in the same dark coat she had been wearing all night, which now carried a dried mud line along the hem and a small tear at the left cuff where she had caught it on the workshop's rolling door. She had not changed. She had decided, somewhere between the equipment yard and the parking structure, that she would not. Lucas and Ella came with her. This was not a decision she had announced or justified. When the Defender pulled into the parking structure, she had simply said, "Come in with me," in the same tone she used for non-negotiable things, and Lucas had looked at her for a moment before deciding not to argue. Ella straightened her jacket and said she was ready. They walked in together through the service entrance. Because the main entrance was full of photographers who had been tipped off, Grace had arranged that through her media attorney, between the equipment yard and the drive-in. The main conference room held 47 people, Caldwell's board, Grace's legal team, 2 rows of institutional investors, the signing lawyers, and the Meridian Group's executive committee, who had spent the night alternating between confusion and the kind of controlled panic that high-level corporate people perform when trying not to appear panicked. They all turned when Grace entered. They registered the coat. They registered Lucas, in work boots and a canvas jacket that still showed the evening's mud. They registered the 8-year-old girl walking with the calm of someone who has been told nothing is wrong and has chosen to believe it. Jackson Wyatt was in the room. He was standing near the far window with 2 of his attorneys, and when Grace's eyes found his, she saw the specific recalibration that moves across a person's face when a situation they believe they controlled has visibly changed. He covered it quickly. He was good at covering. But Grace had been reading rooms for 17 years and had never been wrong about that particular look. She set her bag on the conference table. She produced a tablet with the drive's content already formatted into a structured presentation, prepared in the defender's rear seat using her legal team's remote access, which Lucas's relay had restored. She connected it to the room's display system and gave the room 45 seconds to read the first slide before saying a single word. Silence, applied correctly, is the most efficient form of pressure. When she spoke, she was not angry. Anger is unproductive in a closing argument. She was precise. She named the GPS manipulation. She named Garrett, who was not in the room. He had been detained in the parking structure by her legal security team 11 minutes earlier, based on instructions called in during the drive. She played 18 seconds of the audio recording, just the section where Wyatt confirmed the specific internal file path. She named the shell company that had taken Lucas Carter's patent, cross-referenced it to the Torrent Dynamics financial records on the drive, and put Lucas's name in the sentence without embellishment. Jackson Wyatt attempted to speak twice. His attorney stopped him both times, which was the appropriate thing for attorneys to do, and also, in a room full of institutional investors and signing lawyers, the most damaging visual possible. The police arrived at 12:03, 2 hours ahead of the warrant Grace's lawyer had filed the moment the relay had pushed the drive data through. The timing was not accidental. Jackson Wyatt left the conference room flanked by 2 officers in full view of the Caldwell board, his own institutional partners, and the photographers who had been let through the side corridor at exactly the right moment. The contract was signed at 12:17. When the room began to decompress, lawyers packing files, investors recalibrating their public positions, a journalist Grace had known for 3 years asked her the single most inevitable question in any corporate crisis story: who helped her? Grace looked across the room at Lucas, who was standing near the door with Ella asleep against his shoulder. He had not sat down. He had not spoken to anyone except to answer a direct question from Caldwell's lead attorney, who had recognized his name from an industry publication on terrain vehicle engineering and asked to speak with him privately. A mechanic and his daughter, Grace said, and a truck that everyone underestimated. She paused. Then she added, "He pulled me out of the mud." In every sense of the word. The week after the Caldwell signing moved quickly, as consequential weeks tend to do when there is cleanup work on multiple fronts and several institutional parties recalibrating simultaneously. Jackson Wyatt's attorneys entered plea discussions within 72 hours of his arrest. The audio recording and the drive documentation formed a foundation that even his legal team was not willing to contest. Garrett was cooperating. 2 other inside contacts were identified and placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The Meridian Group's security division conducted an internal audit that found 3 additional points of compromise, all traceable to the same external source. Grace handled all of it with the systematic efficiency that was her native mode. She also did something she hadn't done in approximately 4 years. She cleared her schedule for an afternoon. She drove to Harlow County in a vehicle she had rented specifically because it was unremarkable, a mid-range utility truck that she enjoyed driving more than she expected. She parked at the end of the gravel track and walked to the workshop. The rolling door was open and the sound of an impact wrench was audible from 50 yards. Lucas was underneath a tractor chassis on the manual lift. She knocked on the door frame. The wrench stopped. He rolled out, stood up, and wiped his hands on a shop rag. Ella was at the folding table with her homework. She looked at Grace with the unguarded assessment that children apply to adults they are still deciding about. Then she went back to her work, which meant she had decided. Grace made the offer she had been constructing for 6 days, carefully with the language and the structure, because she understood that this particular offer would fail if it sounded like any offer she usually made. She was not recruiting an asset. She was asking a person. She told Lucas that Meridian Group was launching a terrain vehicle development division, an outcome of the Caldwell merger's integrated logistic component, and that she was looking for a director who understood not just the engineering but the practical, physical reality of what those vehicles needed to do in conditions that no algorithm had been designed for. She told him the patent recovery case had already been filed by her litigation team, that the Torrent Dynamics financial records provided the documentation the original proceeding had lacked, and that her legal team estimated a strong probability of full reinstatement within 12 to 18 months. She named the salary. She did not frame it as charity, because it wasn't. Lucas listened to all of it without expression. Then he looked at the chisel marks on the workbench for a moment, the way a person looks at something familiar before letting it become past tense. "I need to think," he said. "I know," she said. She was leaving when Ella looked up from her homework. "My mom would want him to try," the girl said, in the clear, unhurried voice of someone stating a simple fact they have considered carefully. "She always said he thought too small." Lucas didn't look at his daughter. He looked at the photograph on the shelf, the woman laughing at something off camera. He stood with that for a long moment, the way a person stands at a decision they have been circling for longer than they knew. "I'll need Ella to have the same schedule she has now," he said, to Grace. "I won't negotiate that. Non-negotiable terms are a language I understand," she said. He called her that night. 2 months later, the Defender sat in the Meridian Group's lower parking structure, not because Lucas had moved there, but because he had parked it there one Tuesday morning and it had stayed, quietly acquiring the belonging of a thing that knew its place. It was still rusted at the seams, still missing the chrome trim on the passenger door. No one had suggested fixing those things, because no one who worked in that building was willing to be the person who suggested changing anything about the truck that had pulled their company out of the mud. It was not a symbol. It was a Defender. It had done its job the same way it always had, with no interest in recognition, and no part designed for anything other than moving forward through whatever the ground offered. And in the end, that was the whole point.